The stained glass windows of the old Boston Cathedral cast fractured beams of crimson and gold across the aisle, painting my ivory wedding gown in hues of a sunset I couldn't feel. I stood before the altar, my hands trembling beneath the weight of the bouquet, the scent of lilies suffocating me. At 18, I had been a figure skater, a dreamer on ice, my heart as pure as the frost beneath my blades, untouched by love, filled only with visions of spotlights and the roar of a crowd. But a fall had shattered that dream, my ankle, my career, my innocence. And now, at 40, I was here. Margaret Sinclair, bound by a different kind of ice, the cold grip of a marriage I didn't choose. I adjusted the gown, the silk slipping, against my skin like a whispered reminder of how far I'd drifted from that girl on the rink. My father, a once proud businessman now teetering on the edge of ruin, had orchestrated this union to save his crumbling company. Nathaniel Warrington, Nate, as the world called him, was the key to our salvation. A billionaire whose name carried the weight of old money and unyielding power. I'd met him only 3 times before today, each encounter as brief and frigid as a winter gust. He was a man of sharp edges, his presence commanding, his eyes a storm of gray that held no warmth. And yet, here I was, about to vow my life to him. In the front pew, my younger sister Clara sat with her 8-year-old son, Tommy, her hand wrapped tightly around his small fingers. Clara, 35 and a single mother, had always been my rock, her resilience a quiet fire that warmed us both through the darkest years. Her hazel eyes met mine, brimming with worry, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to run to her, to bury my face in her shoulder and let the tears fall. But I couldn't. Not here, not now, not in front of the 100 guests who filled the cathedral, their whispers a low hum beneath the organ's mournful hymn. The heavy oak doors creaked, open, and Nate entered, his black tuxedo tailored to perfection, his stride deliberate, as if he owned the very air he breathed. He didn't look at me, not at first. His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his court, before finally settling on me. Those gray eyes, cold as slate, held no trace of joy, no hint of the tenderness a groom should have. He nodded, a curt gesture, as if I were a contract to be signed, a deal to be sealed. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stand taller, to meet his gaze with the defiance I'd clung to all these years. The priest's voice droned on, his words a blur of scripture and vows, but I barely heard them. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of that last skate, the crack of my ankle, the scream that tore from my throat as my dreams shattered on the ice. I'd been so innocent then, so full of hope, believing that love would find me in a whirlwind of passion, not in the sterile exchange of a business arrangement. But life had other plans, and now I was here, trading my freedom for my father's survival, my heart for his legacy. Do you, Margaret Sinclair, take Nathaniel Warrington to be your lawfully wedded husband? The priest's question snapped me back to the present, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my fingers tightening around the bouquet until the stems bit into my palms. I wanted to say no, to scream it, to run down the aisle and out into the crisp Boston air, but Clara's face flashed in my mind, her tired smile, Tommy's innocent laughter, and I knew I couldn't. Not when their future depended on this moment. I do, I whispered, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. The priest turned to Nate, repeating the question, and I braced myself for his response. He didn't hesitate. I do, he said, his voice low and steady, devoid of emotion. The exchange of rings followed, his touch as cold as the platinum band he slid onto my finger. I mirrored the gesture, my hands shaking as I placed the ring on his. the metal glinting under the cathedral's dim light. It was done. We were bound. Not by love, but by duty. The priest pronounced us husband and wife, and I waited for the kiss, the moment I'd dreaded since the engagement was announced. But Nate didn't move. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he turned to the congregation, his expression unreadable, and I felt a strange mix of relief and rejection twist in my chest. The organ swelled, signaling the end of the ceremony, and the guests rose to their feet, their applause a hollow sound that couldn't fill the emptiness inside me. As we walked down the aisle, his arm stiff beneath mine, I caught Clara's eye again. She gave me a small, encouraging nod, but it did little to ease the ache in my heart. Tommy waved, his gap-toothed grin a fleeting burst of warmth in the coldness of the moment, and I managed a weak smile in return. But as we stepped out of the cathedral, the weight of what I'd just done settled over me like a shroud. I was Margaret Warrington now, a name that carried power, but no promise of happiness. The November wind bit at my bare shoulders as we descended the stone steps, the city skyline looming in the distance, its lights a stark contrast to the darkness. I felt inside. Nate's driver opened the door of a sleek black car, and I slid inside, the leather seats cold against my skin. Nate followed, his presence filling the space, but he said nothing. The silence between us was heavier than the vows we'd just spoken, and I wondered if this was what the rest of my life would be, trapped in a marriage as cold as the ice I'd once loved, with a man who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. The Warrington Grand's ballroom glittered like a constellation brought to earth, its chandeliers casting a warm golden glow over the sea of guests in their tailored suits and shimmering gowns. But the warmth stopped at the surface, never reaching me. I stood at the edge of the room, my ivory wedding gown feeling more like a costume than a symbol of joy. The weight of the platinum band on my finger, a constant reminder of the vow I'd just made. The air buzzed with laughter and the clink of champagne flutes, but I felt like a stranger in my own story, a reluctant actress playing a role I hadn't auditioned for. I scanned the crowd, searching for Clara and Tommy, hoping their familiar faces would anchor me in this sea of unfamiliarity. I spotted them near the dessert table, Tommy's small hand reaching for a chocolate truffle while Clara gently pulled him back, her smile soft but strained. I wanted to go to them, to escape the suffocating weight of this reception. But before I could take a step, a firm hand closed around mine. I turned to find Nate standing beside me, his gray eyes as unreadable as ever, his jaw set in a line that spoke of duty rather than desire. When I said we'd play the part, I meant it, he said, his voice low, carrying that same cold authority I'd heard in the cathedral. Dance with me. It wasn't a request, but a command, and I felt a spark of defiance flare in my chest. I wanted to pull my hand away, to tell him I wasn't his to order around, but the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on us held me in place. This was a performance, a show for the elite of Boston, and I had no choice but to play my role. The orchestra struck up a slow, haunting waltz, the notes weaving through the air like a thread pulling us to the center of the ballroom. Nate's grip on my hand was firm but not harsh, his other hand settling at the small of my back as he led me into the dance. The floor beneath us was polished marble, smooth and cold, a cruel echo of the ice I'd once glided across with such freedom. But this was no rink, and I was no longer that girl. Each step felt like a battle, my body resisting the rhythm even as it followed his lead, muscle memory betraying my heart's protest. I kept my gaze fixed on his chest, unable to meet, his eyes afraid of what I might see or what I might not. The scent of his cologne, a sharp mix of cedar and bergamot, filled the space between us, and I hated how it stirred something in me, a flicker of curiosity I didn't want to feel. His hand at my back was steady, guiding me with a precision that spoke of control, not passion. We moved as one, but there was no unity in it, only the mechanical steps of two people bound by obligation. "You don't need to pretend you're happy," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. "I don't want this either." His words hit me like a slap, sharp and unexpected, and I finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Those gray eyes held no warmth, but there was something else there. A flicker of resignation, a shadow of something he wouldn't let me see. My anger flared, hot and sudden, drowning out the curiosity I'd felt moments before. "Then why are we here?" I hissed, my voice low enough that only he could hear. "If neither of us wants this, why go through with it?" I expected him to snap back, to match my anger with his own, but he didn't. His expression didn't change, but his grip on my hand tightened slightly, just enough to make me aware of it. "Because we both have something to lose," he said, his tone as cold as the marble beneath our feet. "And something to gain." I wanted to ask what he meant, to demand answers, but the music swelled, and he spun me in a slow, deliberate turn, the movement cutting off my words. The crowd around us murmured their approval, their applause a hollow sound that only deepened the ache in my chest. To them, we were the perfect couple, a fairy tale come to life. To me, we were a lie, a transaction sealed with a dance. When the music finally ended, I pulled away as quickly as I could, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep pretending. I turned and fled, weaving through the crowd, ignoring the curious glances and whispered questions. I pushed through a set of glass doors and stepped onto the balcony, the November air biting at my bare arms, the city skyline stretching out before me like a promise I couldn't reach. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white, and let the cold seep into my skin, hoping it would numb the storm inside me. The lights of Boston twinkled below, a stark contrast to the darkness I felt. And I wondered how I'd survive this marriage, this life I hadn't chosen. I thought of Clara and Tommy, of the sacrifices I'd made for them, and the tears I'd been holding back finally fell, hot against my chilled cheeks. I didn't hear Nate approach, but I felt his presence behind me, a shadow in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort me, and for that, I was grateful. We stood there in silence, the city's hum filling the space between us, and I realized that this was our truth. Not the dance, not the vows, but this quiet, unspoken understanding of our shared captivity. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile thread in the tapestry of a life we'd yet to weave. The weeks following the wedding blurred into a haze of forced smiles and hollow pleasantries. Each day, a reminder of the gilded cage I'd stepped into. Nate and I had settled into a routine of polite distance, sharing the penthouse at the top of Warrington Tower, but little else. The sprawling space with its floor-to-ceiling windows and sleek marble floors felt more like a museum than a home, beautiful, cold and untouchable, much like the man I now called my husband. I spent my days avoiding him, retreating to the guest room I'd claimed as my own, its walls a sanctuary from the storm brewing outside. But the storm found me anyway. The tabloids had latched onto our marriage with a vicious hunger, their headlines, screaming accusations that cut deeper than I'd expected. "Gold digger snags Warrington heir," one read, accompanied by a grainy photo of me at the cathedral, my face pale and drawn. "Sinclair's last gambit, a marriage for money," another declared, as if my life could be reduced to a single sordid transaction. I'd known the elite world Nate inhabited would be ruthless, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly it would turn me into a target, a scapegoat for their gossip and scorn. The pressure reached its peak at a charity auction held at the Warrington estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Boston that reeked of old money and older grudges. The ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, with crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across the crowd, their diamonds and designer gowns glittering like stars. I wore a deep emerald dress, its fabric clinging to my frame, a choice Clara had insisted on to make me feel powerful. But I felt anything but powerful as I stood at the edge of the room, clutching a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, my stomach churning with dread. It didn't take long for the vultures to descend. Eleanor Warrington, Nate's older sister, glided toward me, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the icy disdain in her blue eyes. At 45, she was the matriarch of the Warrington family, a woman who wielded her influence like a weapon, her every word a calculated strike. She'd never approved of me, that much was clear from the moment we met. But tonight, her hostility was palpable, a storm brewing beneath her polished exterior. "You don't belong here, Margaret," she said, her voice a venomous whisper, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, but soft enough to maintain her veneer of civility. "This world isn't for people like you. Opportunists who think they can buy their way into our legacy." Her words hit me like a slap, each syllable a dagger aimed at the fragile armor I'd built around myself. I felt the eyes of the room turn toward us, their whispers a rising tide, and my fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, the pressure threatening to snap it in two. I wanted to respond, to tell her she was wrong, that I hadn't chosen this life, that it had been thrust upon me by a father desperate to save his name. But the words caught in my throat, my voice silenced by the weight of her contempt. I stood, there, frozen, my cheeks burning with shame as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, their judgment a suffocating fog. I was a fraud in their eyes, a pretender in a world I'd never wanted to join. And Eleanor's words only confirmed what I'd feared all along. I didn't belong. Nate appeared at my side before I could crumble, his presence a sudden anchor in the storm. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, but his hand found mine, his grip firm and unyielding. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low and cold, each word a warning. "And you'll treat her with the respect she deserves." The room fell silent, the tension crackling like static, and for a moment I thought Eleanor might back down. But she only smiled, a predator's grin, and turned away, her heels clicking against the marble as she disappeared into the crowd. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in silence, the city lights blurring past the car window as I stared out, my hands clenched in my lap. The weight of the evening pressed down on me, Eleanor's words echoing in my mind, each one a reminder of my place in this world, or lack thereof. I felt the tears I'd held back all night rise to the surface, hot and relentless. And I turned, my face away from Nate, hoping he wouldn't see. But he did. "I don't need you to protect me," I said, my voice trembling, the tears spilling over despite my efforts to hold them back. I wiped at my cheeks, angry at myself for showing weakness, angry at him for witnessing it. He didn't respond at first, his hand steady on the wheel, but when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, a crack in the armor he always wore. "But I need you, Maggie," he said, the words so quiet I almost missed them. I turned to him, startled, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes were still on the road, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability, a shadow of something I couldn't name. It was the first time he'd called me Maggie, the first time he'd spoken to me with anything resembling emotion, and it left me reeling, my heart a tangled mess of confusion and longing. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive, but his words lingered, a fragile thread in the darkness between us. I didn't know if I could trust them, didn't know if I could trust him, but for the first time since the wedding, I felt a spark of something I hadn't expected. Hope. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there, a light beneath the night sky, waiting to be kindled. The penthouse was a fortress of silence in the early morning light, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a gray Boston skyline that mirrored the heaviness in my chest. I stood in the kitchen, the marble countertop cold beneath my fingertips, a cup of coffee growing tepid in my hands. Nate had left for a meeting before dawn, his absence a relief I didn't want to admit. The events of the charity auction still lingered like a bruise. Eleanor's venomous words, the weight of the crowd's judgment, and Nate's unexpected confession in the car. "I need you, Maggie." The memory of his voice, softer than I'd ever heard it, stirred a confusion I wasn't ready to face. I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the one thing that had always grounded me: my family. My phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with Clara's name. I answered immediately, her voice a lifeline in the sterile expanse of the penthouse. "Maggie, it's Tommy," she said, her tone tight with worry. "He's got a high fever, 104 degrees. I'm taking him to the hospital now." My heart dropped, the coffee cup slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor, the sound a sharp echo in the empty space. "I'm coming," I said, already grabbing my coat, the shards of porcelain forgotten in my rush. The hospital was a maze of sterile white corridors, the antiseptic smell stinging my nose as I hurried to the pediatric ward. I found Clara in a small room, sitting beside Tommy's bed, her face pale but composed, her hand resting on his small forehead. Tommy lay under a thin blanket, his cheeks flushed, his breathing shallow but steady. An IV line snaked from his arm, and the sight of it, so small, so fragile, sent a wave of fear through me. I dropped my bag and knelt beside the bed, my hands trembling as I adjusted the blanket, tucking it gently around his shoulders. "How is he?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the beeping of the monitor. "He's stable," Clara said, her voice steady but strained. "The doctors think it's a viral infection, but they're running tests to be sure. He's been asking for you." She managed a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I looked at Tommy, his lashes dark against his fevered skin, and felt a lump rise in my throat. He was the closest thing I had to a child of my own, a bright spot in the darkness of my life, and the thought of him suffering was more than I could bear. I sat beside Clara, taking her hand in mine, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. "You don't have to do this, Maggie," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "This marriage, this life, it's not what you wanted. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for Dad's mistakes." Her words hit me like a punch, unearthing memories I'd buried deep. I thought of the day Dad had sat me down, 20 years ago, his face etched with desperation, as he told me I had to give up skating to help with the family business. I'd been 18, my dreams still fresh, my ankle still healing from the fall that had ended my career. I'd wanted to fight, to scream, but I'd seen the fear in his eyes, the weight of his failures, and I'd said yes. I'd always said yes. Now, here I was again, saying yes to a marriage I didn't want, to a man I didn't love, all to save a legacy that wasn't mine. The tears I'd been holding back spilled over, hot against my cheeks, and I buried my face in my hands, the weight of it all too much to bear. Clara wrapped her arms around me, her embrace a quiet strength, and I let myself cry. For Tommy, for her, for the girl I'd been and the woman I'd become. I don't know how long I stayed at the hospital, but the sky was dark by the time I returned to the penthouse, my eyes red and my heart heavy. I expected the space to be empty, but Nate was there, standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned as I entered, his gray eyes searching my face, and I braced myself for the cold indifference I'd come to expect. But instead, he set the glass down and crossed the room, his movements deliberate but not harsh. "I heard about Tommy," he said, his voice low, softer than I'd expected. "I've arranged for the best pediatric specialist in the city to see him tomorrow." I blinked, caught off guard by the gesture, my defenses crumbling under the weight of my exhaustion. "I don't need your pity," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, the words a reflex born of fear and pride. He didn't flinch, but his expression shifted, a flicker of something raw passing through his eyes. "It's not pity, Maggie," he said, his voice steady, but laced with an emotion I couldn't name. "I'm doing this because I know what it's like to lose someone you love. I won't let that happen to you." His words hung in the air, heavy with a history he hadn't shared, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. I wanted to push him away, to retreat behind the walls I'd built. But something in his gaze held me there, a silent plea I couldn't ignore. Didn't respond, couldn't find the words, but I felt a crack in the ice between us, a small fracture that let in a sliver of light. I turned away, my hands trembling as I poured myself a glass of water, the cool liquid a balm against the rawness in my throat. Nate didn't press me, didn't try to fill the silence, and for that, I was grateful. But as I stood there, the city lights glittering beyond the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the man I'd married might be more than the cold facade he showed the world. And for the first time, I wondered if I might be more to him than a means to an end. The penthouse was a cocoon of quiet that evening, the city lights beyond the windows a distant hum against the storm brewing inside me. I stood in the guest room, adjusting the straps of a sapphire gown I'd chosen for the Warrington Foundation's annual gala, my reflection in the mirror a stranger I barely recognized. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of tension. Eleanor's cruelty at the auction, Tommy's illness, and Nate's unexpected kindness at the hospital. His words still echoed in my mind. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." They'd cracked something open between us, a fragile bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. But tonight, I had to play the part of the perfect wife, a role I'd grown to resent more with each passing day. My phone buzzed on the dresser. Clara's name flashing on the screen, I answered, expecting an update on Tommy. He'd been discharged from the hospital, his fever finally broken. But her voice was tight with urgency. "Maggie, I found something," she said. Her words rushed, as if she feared being overheard. "It's about your marriage. I was going through Dad's old files and there's more to it than we thought." My heart sank, a cold dread settling in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara hesitated, then spoke, each word a dagger. "Dad didn't just arrange your marriage to save the company. He was working with Eleanor Warrington. They made a deal. Your marriage was a way to keep Nate from reuniting with someone named Isabel, his ex-fiancée. They wanted to protect the Warrington legacy, to make sure Nate stayed focused on the family empire." The room spun, the sapphire gown suddenly too tight, the air too thin. I gripped the edge of the dresser, my knuckles white, as Clara's words sank in. My marriage wasn't just a transaction to save my father's business. It was a calculated move to control Nate's life, to erase his past. And I was the pawn in their game. I don't remember ending the call, but I found myself storming through the penthouse, my heels clicking against the marble floor, my anger a living thing clawing at my chest. Nate was in his office, the door ajar, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating his silhouette as he reviewed a stack of documents. He looked up as I entered, his gray eyes narrowing at the sight of my expression, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "Is it true?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and betrayal. "Did you marry me to forget Isabel?" The air between us thickened, the silence stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Nate set down his pen, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a shadow of something raw, and I knew Clara's words were true before he even opened his mouth. "Yes," he said, his voice low, the single word a confession that hit me like a physical blow. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, the weight of his admission threatening to crush me. "But that's not the whole truth," he continued, standing now, his hands braced on the desk as if to steady himself. "I did agree to the marriage to move on from Isabel. Eleanor and your father. They made it clear that my past was a liability, that I had to let her go to protect the family name. But Maggie... He paused, his voice softening, a crack in the armor he always wore. I didn't expect to feel something for you. I didn't expect to care. His words hung in the air, a lifeline I wasn't sure I could grasp. I wanted to scream, to tell him he had no right to feel anything for me, that I wasn't a consolation prize in his carefully curated life. But there was something in his gaze, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, a pain that mirrored my own. I thought of my own sacrifices, the dreams I'd buried, the years I'd spent putting my family first, and I realized that we weren't so different. We were both prisoners of our pasts, bound by the choices others had made for us. I took a step closer, my anger giving way to something softer, something I couldn't name. We've both been hurt, Nate, I said, my voice steadier now, though my hands still trembled at my sides. We've both given up things we loved because we thought we had to, but we don't have to keep living like this. I reached out, my fingers brushing his shoulder, the contact tentative but real. His breath hitched, a subtle shift, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. But he didn't. He stood there, his eyes locked on mine, and I saw something new in them. Hope. Fragile, but undeniable. The moment was broken by the chime of the clock, a reminder of the gala we were expected to attend. I stepped back, smoothing, my gown, my heart a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. We should go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nate nodded, his expression unreadable once more. But as we left the office, his hand brushed mine, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small step across the chasm between us, a promise of something more. The gala awaited us, a stage for the performance we had to give. But as we stepped into the elevator, the city lights glittering below, I felt a shift inside me. The secret of our marriage had been a wound, but it was also a bridge, a way to understand the man I'd married. And for the first time, I wondered if we might find a way to heal, together. The revelation of our marriage's true purpose hung over me like a storm cloud, its shadow darkening every step I took. The Warrington Foundation Gala had been a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations, but Nate's confession in the penthouse office had shifted something between us, a fragile thread of understanding that I wasn't sure I could trust. Yet, as we returned to the penthouse that night, his hand brushing mine in the elevator, I felt a flicker of hope, a whisper of possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could build something real from the ashes of our arranged union. But the world had other plans. By morning, the tabloids had exploded with the story, their headlines screaming betrayal and deceit. Warrington heir trapped in loveless scheme, one blared, accompanied by a photo of Nate and me at the gala, my expression strained, his jaw tight. Sinclair Warrington marriage, a deal to bury the past, another declared, digging up details of Nate's ex-fiancée, Isabel, and the role my father and Eleanor had played in keeping them apart. The articles painted Nate as a cold manipulator, me as a willing accomplice, and our marriage as a sham designed to protect the Warrington legacy at any cost. I stood in the penthouse kitchen, the tablet on the counter displaying the latest article, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the comments. "She's just a pawn in their game," one read. "He never got over Isabel. Poor girl doesn't stand a chance," another sneered. Each word was a knife, cutting deeper into the wounds I'd been trying to heal. I wanted to scream, to tell the world that I hadn't known, that I'd been as much a victim as Nate, but the truth felt hollow in the face of their judgment. The elite world I'd been thrust into had turned on us, and I felt the weight of their scorn like a physical blow. Nate found me there, his face a mask of controlled fury as he set his phone down on the counter. "Eleanor leaked it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. each word a shard of ice. She called me this morning, said I'd never be free of the family's expectations, that I don't deserve happiness after what I did to Isabel. He clenched his fists, the knuckles whitening, and I saw the storm in his gray eyes, a tempest of anger and guilt that mirrored my own. Eleanor's betrayal wasn't just a blow to our marriage. It was a declaration of war, a threat to destroy everything Nate had built. The media frenzy escalated over the next few days, culminating in a press conference Nate was forced to hold at the Warrington Tower. I stood beside him in the conference room, the glare of camera flashes blinding, the hum of reporters' questions a relentless assault. I wore a tailored navy dress, my hair pulled back in a tight chignon, every detail curated to project strength I didn't feel. Nate's hand rested on the small of my back, a steadying presence. But I could feel the tension in his touch, the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. He stepped to the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "The rumors about my marriage are true," he said, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "It was arranged, a decision made to protect my family's legacy. But what you don't know, what you'll never understand, is that I've come to care for my wife deeply. I've made mistakes, but I won't let them define our future. I won't let anyone take that away from us." His voice broke on the last word, a crack in his armor that sent a ripple through the room, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The reporters erupted, their questions a barrage of accusations. But Nate didn't flinch. He turned to me, his hand finding mine, his grip firm and unyielding. "We're in this together," he whispered. His voice meant only for me, and I saw something in his eyes. Resolve, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness that took me by surprise. I squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement, and for the first time I felt like we were a team, facing the storm as one. We returned to the penthouse that evening, the weight of the day clinging to us like damp fog. Clara and Tommy were waiting for us, having come over to escape the media frenzy that had descended on their small apartment. Tommy ran to me as I stepped through the door, his small arms wrapping around my legs, and I knelt to hug him, the warmth of his embrace a balm against the coldness of the world outside. "Aunt Maggie, are you okay?" he asked, his voice small, his hazel eyes, so like Clara's, wide with concern. "I'm okay, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile as I ruffled his hair, my fingers lingering to smooth a stray lock behind his ear. Clara watched us from the couch, her expression a mix of worry and gratitude, and I felt a surge of love for them both, a reminder of why I'd agreed to this marriage in the first place. I stood, helping Tommy settle on the couch with a book, and turned to Clara. "Thank you for being here," I said, my voice thick with emotion. She nodded, her hand reaching for mine, and I felt the strength of our bond, a lifeline I'd never take for granted. Later, as Tommy drifted off to sleep, I sat beside him, the soft rise and fall of his chest a quiet rhythm in the dim light. Nate joined me, his presence a silent comfort, and we sat there for a long time, the city lights glittering beyond the window. "I meant what I said today," he said finally, his voice low, his eyes on Tommy. "I won't let them take this away from us." I looked at him, seeing the man beneath the billionaire, the man who'd lost so much and was fighting to hold on to what he had left. "I believe you," I said, my voice steady, and I realized I meant it. The storm of public scrutiny had battered us, but it had also forged something new, a partnership, a family, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could weather this together. The fallout from the press conference lingered like a bitter aftertaste, the media's scrutiny a constant hum in the background of our lives. But something had shifted between Nate and me that day, a quiet understanding forged in the crucible of public judgment. His words, "We're in this together," had taken root, a fragile promise that I clung to as we navigated the storm. The penthouse, once a cold fortress, began to feel like a sanctuary, a place where we could shield Clara and Tommy from the chaos outside. Yet I knew the battle wasn't over. Eleanor's betrayal had been a declaration of war, and I braced myself for her next move. Nate surprised me the following week with a decision that spoke louder than any words. He called me into his office, the same room where I'd confronted him about Isabel, the air still heavy with the memory of that night. He stood by the window, the city skyline a backdrop to his silhouette, and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. Determination, yes, but also a softness that made my breath catch. "I'm stepping back from the merger with Langston Enterprises," he said, his voice steady. "It's a multi-billion-dollar deal, but I'm done letting the company dictate my life. I want to be here. For you, for Clara, for Tommy." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Langston Enterprises was a cornerstone of the Warrington Empire, a deal that had consumed Nate's attention for months. To walk away from it was a sacrifice, a public admission that he valued us over the legacy he'd been groomed to uphold. "Nate, are you sure?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of awe and uncertainty. He nodded, his gray eyes meeting mine with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "I've spent too long putting the family name first," he said. "It cost me Isabel, and I won't let it cost me this. Us." His words hit me like a wave, washing away the last of my defenses. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a fragile hope that maybe we could build something real from the wreckage of our pasts. To show his commitment, Nate arranged a private meeting at the penthouse, inviting my father and Tommy to join us. I hadn't spoken to Dad since Clara's revelation about the marriage deal, my anger a wall I hadn't been ready to breach. But when he arrived, his shoulders stooped, his face etched with regret. I saw a man broken by his own choices, a man who'd lost more than he'd ever gained. Tommy ran to him, his small arms wrapping around Dad's legs, and I watched as my father's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he said, his voice cracking as he knelt to hug Tommy, his hands trembling. "I thought I was saving us, but I only hurt you. I was wrong, about everything." The apology was raw, unpolished, but it was enough. I felt the anger I'd held onto for so long begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet forgiveness I hadn't known I was capable of. I stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "I forgive you, Dad." The words were a release, a weight lifted, and I saw the relief in his eyes, a flicker of the father I'd once known. But the peace was short-lived. That evening, as we sat in the living room, Tommy curled up on the couch with a book. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Isabel is back," it read. "She wants to see Nate. Don't let her ruin everything. Eleanor." My heart stopped, the warmth of the day replaced by a cold dread. Isabel, the woman Nate had loved, the woman he'd been forced to leave, was a ghost I thought we'd buried. But Eleanor's message was a warning, a reminder that she still held the power to destroy us. I showed the message to Nate, my hands shaking as I handed him the phone. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with a storm I couldn't read. "She's trying to manipulate us," he said finally, his voice low. But there was a tremor in it, a hint of the past he'd tried to outrun. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and asked the question I'd been dreading. "If you want to see her, if you want to go back to her, I'll understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, each word a knife in my chest. Nate turned to me, his gaze piercing, and for a moment, I thought he might say yes, that he might choose the past over the present. But then he stepped closer, his hands cupping my face, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't want Isabel," he said, his voice steady now, his eyes locked on mine. "I want you, Maggie, and the family we're building. I'm not going. Anywhere. His words were a vow, more binding than the ones we'd spoken in the cathedral, and I felt tears spill down my cheeks, hot against his hands. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned into him, my arms wrapping around him, my face pressed against his chest as I let the tears fall. His heartbeat was steady beneath my ear, a rhythm that grounded me, and I felt the last of my walls crumble. He held me there, his arms a shield against the world, and for the first time, I believed him, believed in us. Later that night, as Tommy slept, we moved to the living room, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows. Nate turned on the stereo, a slow melody filling the space, and held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said, his voice soft, a question rather than a command. I took his hand, letting him lead me into a slow waltz, our movements tentative at first, then fluid, a harmony we'd never had before. The dance was different this time. Not a performance, not a battle, but a promise. A shared step toward something new. As we moved, I felt a warmth I hadn't known I could feel, a hope that maybe, just maybe, we could redeem the past and build a future worth fighting for. A year had passed since the press conference that had laid bare the truth of our marriage. A year since Nate and I had stood together against the storm of public scrutiny. A year since we'd begun to build something real from the wreckage of our pasts. The penthouse, once a cold monument to Nate's empire, had transformed into a home. Its walls now echoing with the laughter of Tommy, the warmth of Clara's presence, and the quiet moments Nate and I shared in the spaces between. Tonight we were hosting a small gathering to mark the anniversary of the day we'd chosen to fight for each other, a celebration of the family we'd become. The living room was aglow with soft light, strings of fairy lights draped across the windows, casting a warm shimmer over the city skyline beyond. A small table held a spread of Clara's homemade dishes, her famous lasagna, a tray of cookies Tommy had helped bake, and a bottle of wine we'd saved for a special occasion. Tommy darted around the room, his laughter a bright melody as he chased a balloon, his tie slightly askew from his earlier attempts to help set up. I knelt beside him, adjusting the navy blue bow tie with a gentle smile, my fingers lingering to smooth his hair. "You look so handsome," I said, my voice thick with affection, and he grinned, his gap-toothed smile a mirror of Clara's. Clara stood by the window, her hazel eyes soft as she watched us, a glass of wine in her hand. She'd been my rock through everything. The media storm, the revelations, the slow, tentative steps Nate and I had taken toward each other. "You've done good, Maggie," she said, her voice quiet but warm, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I stood, crossing the room to hug her, her embrace a reminder of the bond that had carried us through the darkest times. "I couldn't have done it without you," I whispered, and she squeezed me tighter, her laughter a soft vibration against my shoulder. Nate emerged from the kitchen, a tray of glasses in his hands, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a rare casualness that made him look younger, softer. The man I'd married, the cold, untouchable billionaire, was still there, but he'd shed layers over the past year, revealing a warmth I hadn't thought possible. He set the tray down, his gray eyes meeting mine, and I saw a flicker of the vulnerability he'd shown that night in the office, the night he'd chosen us over his empire. "Everything's ready," he said, his voice low, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The music started, a slow, familiar waltz that filled the room with a gentle rhythm, and Nate held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said, his tone a quiet invitation, echoing the words he'd spoken a year ago. I took his hand, letting him lead me to the center of the room, our movements fluid and sure, a stark contrast to the stiff, reluctant dance we'd shared on our wedding day. This time there was no audience, no pretense, just us, moving as one, our steps a silent promise of the life we'd built together. Tommy ran over, his small arms wrapping around our legs, and we laughed, scooping him up to join us. He giggled. As we spun him in a slow circle, his joy a bright spark that lit up the room, and I felt tears prick my eyes, a mix of happiness and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm me. I set Tommy down, watching as he ran back to Clara and turned to Nate, my hands resting on his shoulders, his arms around my waist. The music faded, but we didn't stop, swaying gently to a rhythm only we could hear. "Thank you, Maggie," Nate said, his voice low, his eyes searching mine, "for giving me a chance to make things right." There was a weight to his words, a depth that spoke of the guilt he'd carried, the mistakes he'd made, and the man he'd become in spite of them. I reached up, my fingers brushing his cheek, the stubble rough against my skin. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady despite the tears that spilled over. "For giving me a family." The words hung between us, a vow more sacred than the ones we'd spoken in the cathedral, and I saw the emotion in his eyes, a mirror of my own. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to mine, and we stood there, wrapped in each other, the city lights a soft glow beyond the window. I thought of the girl I'd been at 18, skating on ice with dreams of a love that would sweep me away, and I realized that I'd found it, not in the whirlwind I'd imagined, but in the quiet, steady growth of this moment, this man, this life. Clara joined us, Tommy in her arms, and we stood together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by the battles we'd fought and the love we'd found. The fairy lights twinkled, the music played on, and I felt a peace I hadn't known I could feel, a happiness that had bloomed late but strong, like a flower breaking through the frost. I looked at Nate, at Clara, at Tommy, and I knew that this was what honor truly meant. Not the legacy of a name, not the weight of wealth, but the act of repairing what was broken, of protecting those you loved, of choosing to stay. As the night drew to a close, we sat together on the couch, Tommy asleep. In my lap, his small hand curled around my finger. Nate's arm rested around my shoulders, Clara's laughter a soft counterpoint to the city's hum, and I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. The dance we'd shared tonight wasn't just a moment. It was a promise, a flame, a love that would endure. And in that late blooming happiness, I found the redemption I'd been searching for all along. If you've enjoyed this journey of love, redemption, and the power of family, I'd truly appreciate it if you could give this story a like and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt tales. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share the next adventure with you. Thank you for being here.